If you flew over the Yuba River Valley in Northern California right now, you would see something that doesn't look like it belongs on this planet. From the air, it looks like the ground was turned inside out. Miles and miles of gravel mounds lined up in long rows, deep trenches cut between them, and pools of turquoise water sitting in the gaps. Some people say it looks like intestines. NASA has photographed it from orbit, and even from that altitude, the scars are obvious. And every single one of those scars was made by a machine. Not a bulldozer, not an excavator. A floating factory the size of a building that ate the earth underneath itself, swallowed anything valuable, and spit the rest out behind it in enormous piles of rock. These were the bucket-line gold dredges, and for about 60 years in the early 20th century, they were the most efficient way to get gold out of the ground that anyone had ever invented. They also destroyed entire valleys in the process. This is that story. It was 1848, and a carpenter named James Marshall had just spotted something shiny in the tail race of a sawmill near Coloma, California. Within months, word had spread across the country, and by 1849, tens of thousands of people were flooding into the Sierra Nevada foothills looking for gold. They brought pans. They brought sluice boxes and rocker cradles. They built wooden long toms along the creeks and worked the gravel by hand from morning until dark. And for a while, the gold was there for the taking. You could stand in a stream bed, scoop up a pan of gravel, swirl it around, and find flakes and sometimes whole nuggets of gold sitting at the bottom. The method was simple, because gold is dense. It's about 19 times heavier than water and roughly 5 times heavier than ordinary gravel. So when you wash a mixture of gold and dirt, the gold sinks and everything else floats away. That basic principle has been the foundation of every placer mining operation in history, and the early California miners used it to pull fortunes out of the rivers by hand. But that didn't last. Within about 5 years, the easy surface gold was gone. The nuggets that had been sitting in stream beds and shallow soil along the riverbanks and sandbars were picked clean. Tens of thousands of miners had worked over every accessible inch of the Sierra Nevada foothills, and they knew that there was still gold down there, deep in the river gravels, packed between layers of sand and clay that had been building up for hundreds of thousands of years. The Yuba River, the American River, the Feather River, all of them had gold-bearing gravels sitting at the bottom of their channels, sometimes 50 or 60 feet below the waterline. The problem was getting to it, so they got creative. Hydraulic mining became the dominant method by the 1850s and 60s. Mining companies built dams and diverted entire rivers to create high-pressure water jets, and they aimed those jets at hillsides. The force of the water blasted apart cliffs and mountainsides, washing enormous volumes of rock and soil down into sluice boxes where the gold could be separated out. It worked. Companies pulled huge amounts of gold out of the Sierra Nevada this way. But the waste had to go somewhere, and it went into the rivers. 685 million cubic feet of mining debris washed down the Yuba River alone. The riverbed near Marysville, California, rose by as much as 100 feet in some places. Farms downstream got buried under layers of gravel, mud, and mercury. The flooding got so bad that the I Street Bridge in Sacramento had to be raised 20 feet just to keep it above the rising riverbed. Farmers fought back in court, and in 1884, a judge named Lorenzo Sawyer issued what became known as the Sawyer Decision. It effectively banned hydraulic mining in California. So now the mining companies had a real problem. The easy gold was gone. Hydraulic mining was illegal. But everyone knew that the deep river gravels, some of them 50 or 60 feet below the water level, were still packed with gold that nobody had touched. The question was, how do you get to gravel that's sitting at the bottom of a river valley without blasting it apart with water cannons? The answer was a machine that could float on the water, dig down into the gravel, process it on the spot, and dump the waste out the back. And that machine already existed in a crude form. Dredges had been used for gold mining in New Zealand as early as 1857, and some steam-powered versions had been tried on California rivers in the late 1800s. But those early dredges were small, unreliable, and couldn't reach deep enough to get to the richest gravels sitting on bedrock. Everything changed in 1904. when a man named W.P. Hammond brought the first serious bucket line dredge to the Yuba River near Marysville. And this is where the story of these machines really begins, because what Hammond introduced was not just a bigger version of what came before, it was a completely different kind of mining operation. Here's how a bucket line gold dredge worked. Picture a building, 3 or 4 stories tall, sitting on a flat wooden or steel hull that floats in a pond. Sticking out of the front of this building is a long steel arm called the ladder, and running along that ladder is a continuous chain of heavy steel buckets, each one weighing over 1,000 pounds. The chain moves like a conveyor belt. The buckets at the bottom of the ladder dig into the river gravel, scoop up huge mouthfuls of dirt and rock, and carry them up and over the top of the ladder, where they dump everything into the machine's interior. Inside the dredge, the material hits a trommel, which is basically a giant rotating cylinder made of steel with holes punched all through it. Water sprays through the trommel as it turns, washing the dirt off the rocks. The big rocks can't fit through the holes, so they ride along the inside of the trommel and get dumped onto a stacker belt that carries them out the back of the dredge and piles them up behind it. That's where the tailing piles come from, those long ridges of gravel that still scar the landscape today. The smaller material, the sand and fine gravel that does fit through the trommel's holes, falls down into sluice boxes underneath. And this is where the gold gets caught. Gold is about 5 times heavier than gravel. So, as the material washes over the cleats and riffles inside the sluice boxes, the gold settles to the bottom and gets trapped while everything else washes through. On some dredges, the sluice boxes were lined with copper plates coated in mercury, which bonded to fine gold particles that were too small to catch any other way. The gold recovery area was kept under lock and key. On the Yankee Fork dredge in Idaho, the worker responsible for collecting gold from the sluice boxes was called the Gold Man, and he was the only person allowed into that section of the machine. He worked inside a locked metal cage, surrounded by the sluice boxes where gold accumulated during the day's run. Nobody else could enter. When it was time to collect, the Gold Man would pull out the copper plates, scrape off the mercury amalgam, and carefully process it to separate the gold. It was painstaking, secretive work, and for good reason. Even a small amount of the material passing through those sluice boxes could be worth a considerable sum. The dredge master, the person who ran the entire operation, also kept a close eye on what was coming through the machine. Material that spilled out from the sides of the trommel drum fell onto a section called the Save All, and the dredge master would examine it regularly. If he spotted larger chunks of gold in the material, he could order the trommel plates changed to adjust the size of the holes, making sure the machine was capturing as much gold as possible. And here's the part that made these machines so effective. The dredge didn't need a river to float on. It created its own pond. Construction always started with digging a large pit and filling it with water to float the hull. Once the dredge was operational, it maintained its own pond by digging forward. As the buckets dug into the ground at the front of the machine, groundwater and river water seeped in and filled the hole. The dredge floated in the water that filled its own excavation. Then, as it dug forward, the pond moved with it. The front of the dredge was always digging new ground, and the back was always dumping waste rock into the water behind it. The machine used an anchor called a spud, a heavy steel shaft that dropped through the hull into the pond bottom, and it pivoted around that anchor, while cables attached to logs buried in the hillsides controlled its side-to-side movement through a winching system. It was like a machine that swallowed the earth in front of it and left a trail of gravel piles behind it, sweeping back and forth across a valley as it inched forward day after day, week after week, for years. This is where the engineering gets truly wild, because these dredges weren't limited to existing rivers or streams. They could strike out across dry ground, digging their own channels as they went. The Sumter Valley dredges in Oregon, for example, were assembled on the Powder River but moved perpendicularly into the ancient gold-rich riverbed on either side of it. As the front buckets cut new channels in the earth, water flowed forward into those channels, keeping the dredge afloat and moving. And when they scaled these things up, the results were staggering. To understand the scale of these things, you have to stop thinking of them as mining equipment and start thinking of them as buildings that float and eat dirt, because that's really what they were. The Klondike Dredge No. 4, built in 1912 on Bonanza Creek near Dawson City in the Yukon, was the largest wooden-hulled bucket dredge in North America. It stood 8 stories tall and stretched 2/3 the length of a football field. People who saw it in operation compared it to a floating hotel, except this hotel made a grinding, clanking roar that could be heard for miles as its bucket chain tore into the frozen creek bed gravel. Its buckets were enormous, each one holding 16 cubic feet of material, and the bucket line ran at 22 buckets per minute. It operated 24 hours a day during the mining season, which ran from about April through November, roughly 200 days a year. Over 46 years of operation, Dredge No. 4 pulled 9 tons of gold out of the Klondike Valley. At its peak, it was extracting up to 800 ounces of gold in a single day. And it wasn't even the biggest one. Up in Alaska, the Fairbanks Exploration Company ran an entire fleet of these giants. Gold Dredge No. 8, built in 1928, was a 5-story machine weighing 1,065 tons. It carried 68 steel buckets on its bucket line, and each of those buckets held 6 cubic feet of material and weighed 1,583 pounds. The bucket line could tear gravel from 35 feet below the water level, but No. 8 was actually one of the smaller dredges in the Fairbanks fleet. The largest Fairbanks dredges had 10 cubic foot buckets and could dig 60 feet down to bedrock. No. 8 operated for 31 years, from 1928 to 1959. In that time, it traveled 4.5 miles across the landscape and recovered 7.5 million ounces of gold. Today, it sits on the National Register of Historic Places as a National Historical Mechanical Engineering Landmark. Down in California, the Yuba Consolidated Goldfields turned dredging into an industrial empire. Starting with Hammond's first dredge in 1904, the company eventually operated 21 dredges across the Yuba River Basin. By 1934, Yuba No. 17 had earned the title of the largest gold dredge in the world. It was an all-steel machine with 16.5 cubic foot buckets, and it could dig 110 feet below the water level. The bucket line alone weighed about 300 tons. The Yuba Manufacturing Company, which grew out of these operations, eventually designed and built 175 dredges that were shipped to mining operations all over the world. And the numbers from the Yuba Goldfields are hard to wrap your head around. Between 1904 and 1968, the dredges working that stretch of the Yuba River processed more than 1 billion cubic yards of earth. That's a billion with a B. To give you some sense of what that means, a billion cubic yards is roughly the amount of material you'd need to fill a pit 1 mile long, 1 mile wide, and about 500 feet deep, and the dredges pulled all of that out of the ground. The total gold recovered from the Yuba Goldfields came to an estimated 5.14 million ounces. The Yuba wasn't the only dredge field either. In Breckenridge, Colorado, a mining entrepreneur named Ben Stanley Rivette ordered his first 2 dredge boats from the Risdon Iron Works in San Francisco back in 1897. Those early dredges were 96 feet long and 30 feet wide, steam-powered, and burned wood for fuel. They could process 2,000 cubic yards of gravel in a 24-hour period, but they couldn't dig deep enough to reach bedrock, and 2 of them had to be dismantled. It took a heavier, 110-foot-long Bucyrus dredge in 1899 to finally get down to the richest gravels. From there, dredging spread across the Colorado mountains and reshaped entire creek valleys. In Sumter Valley, Oregon, the first Yuba-style dredge arrived in 1912. It was 100 feet long and 45 feet wide, made entirely of wood, and carried 65 buckets. A third, larger dredge, built in 1935, ran 125 feet long and crisscrossed the Sumter Valley for nearly 20 years before local opposition and rising costs shut it down in 1954. In the mountains of central Idaho, the Yankee Fork Gold Dredge was assembled in just 5 months in 1940. The Silas Mason Company out of New York had contracted with Bucyrus Erie to build it, and all the materials came by rail to the town of Mackay before being trucked over mountain passes to the construction site. The finished machine weighed 988 tons. It was 112 feet long, 54 feet wide, and 64 feet high, with 71 buckets that each held 8 cubic feet of material. Every single bucket weighed over a ton. The dredge ran on two 350 horsepower Ingersoll-Rand diesel engines and worked the Yankee Fork of the Salmon River until 1952, with a break during World War II, when the government shut down non-essential gold mining to redirect labor and materials toward the war effort. Building and deploying these machines was an enormous undertaking in itself. The dredges were manufactured by companies in the lower 48 states. Firms like the Yuba Manufacturing Company in California, the Bucyrus Erie Company in Wisconsin, and the Marion Steam Shovel Company. Then they were shipped, often in pieces, to remote locations across the West and Alaska. For the Alaskan operations, shipping costs frequently accounted for 2/3 of the total cost of the dredge, because every piece of steel, every gear, every bucket had to be transported thousands of miles by rail and barge, and then assembled on site in some of the most isolated terrain on the continent. Once running, these machines operated around the clock. Crews worked them in shifts, keeping the bucket line moving for roughly 23 hours out of every 24. That extra hour went to oiling and greasing the parts that could only be reached when the machine was idle, and to repositioning the dredge within its pond. They ran 7 days a week for the entire mining season, and the only thing that stopped them was winter freeze-up or mechanical failure. In Alaska, where the ground was locked in permafrost, companies had to thaw the frozen earth ahead of the dredge before it could dig. They laid networks of pipes called cold water points into the ground and pumped water through them for weeks to soften the permafrost before the dredge arrived. The whole operation was a logistical chain that started months before the bucket line ever started turning. But all of that machinery, all of that effort, all of that gold, it came with a price tag that nobody was paying attention to at the time. By the middle of the 20th century, the golden age of dredging was already starting to wind down, and the reasons were mostly economic. After World War II, wages for workers climbed steadily, but the price of gold stayed fixed at $35 an ounce, set by the federal government. That meant operating costs kept going up, while revenue stayed flat. One by one, the big dredge operations started doing the math and realizing they couldn't make money anymore. The last of the Yuba dredges shut down in 1968. Across Alaska, California, Idaho, Oregon, and Colorado, the giant machines went silent. Some were dismantled and sold. Parts were shipped to South America, where labor was cheaper and the economics still worked. Some were simply abandoned where they sat, left to rust in the ponds they had dug for themselves. And what they left behind is, honestly, hard to believe unless you see it. The Yuba Goldfields cover thousands of acres along the Yuba River. From ground level, you see endless rows of gravel mounds stretching to the horizon, separated by narrow channels of water. The mounds stand anywhere from 10 to 50 feet tall, and they go on for miles. Nothing about the landscape looks natural. It looks like the surface of another planet, or like some enormous animal burrowed through the earth and left behind a trail of upturned soil. From the air, through NASA satellite imagery, the Yuba Goldfields are unmistakable. The long gray shapes of the tailings piles show up against the green farmland around them, and the blue pools of water sit in the gaps between the gravel rows. The footprint stretches from about 6 to 12 miles upstream of Marysville, covering the entire floodplain of the Yuba River. And the Yuba is just one dredge field. Similar landscapes exist near Fairbanks, across the Klondike, along the rivers of Colorado, and throughout the mountain valleys of Idaho and Oregon. The environmental damage went beyond just rearranging the landscape. Mercury was a standard tool in gold recovery for decades. Miners used it to coat the copper plates in their sluice boxes because mercury bonds with gold, trapping fine particles that would otherwise wash away. Across California alone, An estimated 10 million pounds of mercury were released into the environment during the mining era, from the 1860s through the early 1900s. That mercury is still in the rivers, the soil, and the sediment today. It converts into methylmercury, which is a potent neurotoxin that accumulates in fish and moves up the food chain to wildlife and humans. Some estimates suggest that cleaning up all the mercury contamination from California's gold mining era would require dredging or bulldozing about 10% of the state's total land area. The dredges also destroyed farmland. The Yuba River's gravel load, swollen with debris from decades of hydraulic and dredge mining, buried agricultural land around Marysville under layers of coarse sediment. The flooding got worse as the riverbed rose, and farming communities that had depended on the river for irrigation found their water choked with mining waste. Towns like Marysville and Yuba City, which sat right in the path of the sediment flow, dealt with chronic flooding for decades. The legal battles between miners and farmers shaped some of the earliest environmental law in the United States. Going all the way back to the Sawyer decision of 1884, the same ruling that had killed hydraulic mining. And the irony is that the dredges, which were supposed to be the cleaner alternative to hydraulic mining, ended up reshaping the same valleys in a different but equally permanent way. But here's the thing about the Yuba Goldfields today that nobody expected. Wildlife moved in. The strange, cratered landscape that the dredges left behind turns out to be surprisingly good habitat. The pools of water between the tailing piles have become wetlands. Wild turkeys roam the gravel mounds. Deer, beavers, river otters, great blue herons, and bald eagles all live there now. Mountain lions have been spotted in the goldfields. The landscape that the dredges turned into a moonscape has, over the past half-century, slowly turned itself into something like an accidental nature reserve. And several of the dredges themselves have been preserved. Klondike Dredge No. 4 is a National Historic Site near Dawson City, where visitors can walk through the 8-story wooden structure and see the massive bucket line that dug up an entire valley. Gold Dredge No. 8 in Fairbanks offers tours by narrow-gauge train and lets visitors pan for gold at the site. The Sumter Valley Gold Dredge in Oregon sits in a state heritage area, and the Yankee Fork Gold Dredge in Idaho is the only surviving dredge where you can walk through every section of the machine, from the bucket line at the front to the sluice boxes inside their locked metal cage. If you ever get the chance to walk through one of these machines, the scale hits you in person in a way that photographs don't prepare you for. The bucket line alone, with its chain of steel scoops hanging from a steel ladder, looks like something from a science fiction set. The gears that drove the system are taller than a person. The trommel drum, the rotating cylinder that sorted the rock, is wide enough to stand inside. Everything about these machines was built to handle forces that would tear apart ordinary equipment, because ordinary equipment couldn't survive the job of chewing through a river valley. These dredges are strange monuments. They were engineering marvels, machines that could do the work of 1,000 prospectors in a single day without a backache. As one writer from the early 1900s put it, a single dredge could process more gravel in 24 hours than hundreds of miners with shovels and pans could move in a week. They turned unprofitable ground into paying operations and kept entire towns alive during the Depression, when Gold Dredge No. 8 and its sister machines were among the only reliable employers in interior Alaska. But they were also machines of total landscape destruction. They didn't just mine the earth, they ate it. They swallowed whole river valleys, digested the gold, and left behind miles of gravel wreckage that will be visible for centuries. The tailing piles don't erode the way natural landforms do, because the rocks have been washed clean of the fine sediment that would normally bind them together. They just sit there, row after row, like the ribs of some enormous buried skeleton. If you visit the Yuba Goldfields, or drive through the Klondike along Bonanza Creek Road, or pull off the highway near Sumter, Oregon, what you're looking at is a landscape that was literally turned upside down by a machine. The topsoil is gone, the river is rerouted, the bedrock has been scraped clean. And yet, gold was found, fortunes were made, towns were built, and an entire industry rose and fell around these extraordinary floating factories. The gold dredges are gone now. The last of the big bucket line machines shut down decades ago, and most of them have been reduced to rust and salvage. The few that survive do so as museums and monuments, as reminders of an era when the appetite for gold was large enough to justify swallowing entire valleys to get it. If you enjoyed this one, do me a favor and hit the subscribe button, drop a like, and let me know in the comments which destroyed landscape or forgotten machine you'd want to see covered next.